In our headlines on this Friday afternoon, May 19th, here in South Korea. The Group of 7 summit is underway in Hiroshima, with this year's gathering extended to include 8 outreach nations, including South Korea, as global leaders seek to tackle broader security challenges. Meanwhile, Seoul is slated to send its team of inspectors to assess Tokyo's planned discharge of radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant on May 21st for a week-long mission. And 2 sets of Korea's historical documents related to the April 19 revolution and the Donghak Peace Revolution in the late Joseon dynasty are added onto UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. We start over in neighboring Japan, where the G7 summit is underway. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida welcomed his counterparts within the Group of 7 at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park earlier this morning. The park commemorates victims of the atomic bomb that targeted the city during World War II and includes the structures of the few buildings that withstood the explosion. This year's G7 gathering includes 8 other invited guest nations, including South Korea, whose leaders are scheduled to visit the park on Sunday. And as I just mentioned, President Yoon Suk-yeol is attending the event this year as an outreach member of the Group of 7 amid shared concerns regarding fundamental global challenges. Our Shin Se-byuk covers the agenda ahead.
South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol will fly over to Hiroshima on Friday for the G7 summit. He will be the 4th South Korean leader to participate in the multilateral event. The total of 9 sessions will start on Friday with a discussion about the global economy over a working lunch, and in the afternoon, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky joining virtually. Indo-Pacific-related issues, most likely centered around Chinese issues, along with nuclear disarmament, are also expected over a working dinner. On Saturday, economic security talks in the morning will be followed by expanded sessions with 8 invited countries, including South Korea, India, and Australia. The talks will cover 2 themes: food, public health, development, and gender, and climate change and energy security, where Yoon is to share his views on. On the final day, an event for invited leaders and a session on peace, stability, and prosperity will precede the closing ceremony. President Yoon will be returning to Seoul on Sunday. Meanwhile, during the 3-day summit, Yoon is set to have one-on-one meetings with 6 government leaders. Those include talks with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida on Sunday. The 2 leaders are also scheduled to make a joint visit to a monument honoring Korean victims of the 1945 atomic bomb that wrecked Hiroshima. The highly anticipated trilateral summit between Yoon, Kishida, and U.S. President Joe Biden has not been announced yet. However, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Wednesday said the 3 leaders are eager to meet and that it's a matter of scheduling, while mentioning Biden has a packed schedule. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
Right, staying in Japan, amid efforts to ensure a trilateral summit among the leaders of South Korea, the U.S. and Japan on the margins of the G7 meeting, much optimism has been shared about the advances thus far in rapprochement between Seoul and Tokyo. Our Moon Hye-ryun reports.
South Korea and Japan are expected to continue mending ties at the G7 summit this Friday through Sunday in Hiroshima. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met with U.S. President Joe Biden on Thursday ahead of the G7 summit, where he said he will continue to work towards improving South Korea-Japan relations. Biden responded that he welcomes news of the 2 nations strengthening ties. This comes after Kishida extended an invitation to South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol to be a guest at the summit of the Group of 7. Earlier this month, the 2 leaders held a summit in Seoul. Ahead of the G7, Kishida and Biden also discussed ways to strengthen their trilateral relations with South Korea regarding North Korea's nuclear threat and China's growing assertiveness. Nuclear issues are likely to figure prominently at the G7 summit, whose host city Hiroshima was devastated by an atomic bomb at the end of World War II. Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington have a 3-way summit scheduled on the sidelines, where the 3 nations are likely to discuss North Korea's growing missile threat as well as deterrence measures. The United States has welcomed recent efforts by South Korea and Japan to improve relations, as North Korea's increasing long-range missile capabilities are regarded as not only a threat to South Korea and Japan's security, but also to the US mainland. Seoul and Tokyo are also concerned about potential security threats that may arise from a potential conflict between China and Taiwan, while the United States is looking to counter China's growing global influence. 문혜련, Arirang News.
Seoul, meanwhile, is sending its own group of inspectors to assess Tokyo's planned discharge of its Fukushima radioactive wastewater. The delegation will depart on Sunday for a roughly week-long mission. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji has more.
A team of 21 South Korean experts will be sent to Japan to conduct an on-site inspection before the planned release of radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The group will be in Japan for 6 days starting Sunday. Announcing the details of the plan, the South Korean government said the team aims to gather information that's needed to ensure the health and safety of the Korean public.
Through the inspection, we will verify Japan's water purification and discharge facilities for ourselves, as well as its ability to analyze radioactive material. We will also gather information needed for scientific and technological research.
On the first day, the 21-member team will hold a meeting with related Japanese organizations, including the Tokyo Electric Power Company, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and Japan's Nuclear Regulation Authority. From May 23rd to 24th, they will inspect the facilities at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And on the last day, the 25th, they will hold an in-depth discussion with the Japanese organizations, based on the information gathered from the on-site inspection. This mission comes after South Korean President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida agreed during their summit on May 7th to allow South Korean experts to visit Fukushima and conduct an inspection separately from the one currently being carried out by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Earlier in January, Japan announced it will release over 1 million tons of water from its destroyed power plant into the Pacific Ocean within this year, after treatment using what's called the ALP system. The Japanese government claims this removes most of the radioactive contamination, with the exception of tritium, but this raised strong concerns from South Korea and other nearby countries. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
Archives linked to Korea's democracy have been listed onto UNESCO's Memory of the World Register, which seeks to protect the world's documentary heritage. Our Lee Seung-jae has details.
The April 19th revolution led to the resignation of President Syngman Rhee and became a cornerstone for the development of democracy in South Korea. And long before this movement, the Dongguk Peasant Revolution in the late Joseon dynasty fought against corrupt leadership and foreign aggression. Both events were integral in South Korea's push to achieve democracy. To mark the significance of the two movements, UNESCO on Thursday added South Korea's archival records related to the two grassroots revolutions to UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. According to the Cultural Heritage Administration, the archives of the April 19th revolution included over 1,000 materials related to the 1960 civil uprising that ended the dictatorship of South Korea's first president in 1960. The documents show the causes and development of the revolution and are made up of materials from government agencies, the National Assembly, and political parties, as well as media articles, personal records, investigative reports, photographs, and videos. And the archives of the Dongguk Peasant Revolution consist of a total of 185 documents related to the uprising against the corruption within the ruling class and the fight against the Japanese presence in Korea. The civil movement consisted of an armed rebellion led by peasants and followers of the Dongguk religion during the Joseon dynasty. The latest edition brings the total of South Korea's heritage items on the UNESCO list to 18, and the first since 2017, when a royal seal, an investiture book collection from the Joseon dynasty, the archives of the National Debt Redemption Movement, and Joseon Tongshinsa, which consist of diplomatic records of Korean envoys to Japan, were all added to the UNESCO list. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And moving on to the latest, with regard to Kremlin's hostile policy in Eastern Europe, a series of Russian missile assaults have been averted by Ukraine's air defense in recent days. Our Yoon reports.
Early Thursday local time, Russia fired 30 cruise missiles against different parts of Ukraine, testing the capabilities of Ukraine's air defenses. Ukraine's Air Force said in a statement that 29 of the missiles were shot down, as were 2 exploding drones and 2 reconnaissance drones. Ukrainian forces shot down most of the Russian missiles directed at the region, but falling debris set off fires in several areas, and the missile that got through struck an industrial building in the southern region of Odessa, killing 1 person and wounding 2. The mayor of Kyiv warned people to remain in shelters as falling debris from the shootdown caused fires. There have been no immediate reports of casualties. Overnight, loud explosions sounded throughout Kyiv as Russian forces targeted the capital for the 9th time this month. This was following Ukraine shooting down 6 Russian hypersonic missiles in a single night earlier in the week on Tuesday. Lately, there's been a significant increase in the frequency of missile attacks from Russia. In a separate development, a freight train transporting grain in Russian-occupied Crimea derailed, reportedly due to an explosion. Train services on the affected section of the line have been suspended and no injuries have been reported. The railway operator said the incident was caused by the intervention of third parties and an investigation would be carried out. Meanwhile, G7 leaders are gathering in Hiroshima for discussions on Friday, during which the Russian invasion of Ukraine will be high on the agenda. According to a U.S. official, the latest U.S. sanctions would cut off roughly 70 entities from Russia and other countries from receiving U.S. exports by adding them to the commerce blacklist. And there will be upwards of 300 new sanctions against individuals, entities, vessels, and aircraft. 이은진, Arirang News.
Back on the local front, Korea's space rocket Nuri is poised to carry actual payloads into space during its 3rd launch next Wednesday. Our Choi Seong has more on the 8 satellites.
South Korea's aerospace history will be rewritten on May 24th. The Nuri space rocket's 3rd launch is completely different from the 2 previous ones. The 1st and 2nd launches in October 2021 and June 2022 were test launches with dummies, but this time is the first operational launch carrying 8 actual satellites. So, which satellites will be on board? First, the largest and heaviest main payload satellites, next-generation small satellites the 2nd, made by KAIST, will be placed at the front of the 3rd stage of Nuri. It has a main camera with a resolution of 5 meters, an observation width of 40 kilometers, and weighs 150 kilograms to help it explore 600 to 800 kilometers of mission altitude ranges. It uses an imaging radar that is not affected by light or clouds, day and night, or even severe weather conditions.
NextSat, the 2nd, is primarily a satellite that captures radar images. It is a synthetic satellite that sends radar waves and detects the return waves to create composite images. It differs from the optical camera images and has differences in performance compared to the existing Arirang 5 satellite due to its scale.
4 Doyosat, named after small but fast birds, developed by the Korea Astronomy and Space Science Institute, will also be on board. It is also known as SNIPE, small-scale magnetospheric and ionospheric plasma experiment, the world's very first, where 4 satellites fly in formation to observe space weather. 4 nanosatellites, Garam, Nare, Dasol, and Laon, about 10 kilograms each, will provide real-time transmission of fine space plasma distribution, Earth's magnetic field, solar wind, and space storms at a mission altitude of 500 kilometers. In this 3rd launch, the achievements of Korean satellite manufacturing companies are noticeable. The space radiation detector by Lumir, the optical payload by JustTech, and the polarimetric camera by Cairo-Space will perform their respective missions. In particular, Cairo-Space's CUBE satellites will come back to Earth automatically without space debris after the mission is complete. These 8 satellites will be a milestone for Korea as a space powerhouse, venturing into space with the country's cutting-edge technology. Choi Soo-hyung, Arirang News.
And in other news, a new type of rice flour looks to emerge as a potential solution to better tackle the challenge of surplus rice here in Korea. Our Lee Soo-jin explains.
South Korea has come up with a new type of rice flour. It's called karumi, and it could be the answer to the nation's excess rice issue. The average amount of rice consumed per person in the country last year fell to a record low of 56.7 kilograms, around half of what was consumed 30 years ago. To address this, the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs is planning to promote the usage of karumi, or rice flour, the world's first that doesn't require water.
Normally, rice needs to be soaked in water overnight so it can be ground into fine powder. This not only requires a large amount of water, but nutrients may also be lost.
This type of rice flour, however, produced from a mutant variety of rice developed by the Rural Development Administration, has a starch structure similar to that of wheat, allowing it to be dry milled.
If rice is dry milled, it can save production costs and the quality of the starch remains intact. So when the bread is made with this flour, it remains gluten-free and chewy.
This bakery, located in Sejong, is one of the 9 in the nation that uses more than 1 ton of karumi. The baker takes the rice flour and whisks it into the mixer along with the same ingredients that are added when baking with wheat. The ratio of egg whites to yolk for cake rolls, however, is 50-50, which requires more heating. The dough is then placed in the oven without the addition of gluten. The wide variety of bread made using karumi has been received well by customers.
People say that karumi bread is easier to digest and that it's chewy. It also has a soft texture.
There are still several barriers to overcome before karumi can be commercialized. Its price, in particular. The head baker pays nearly $70 for one 20-kilogram bag. As of December 2022, a 20-kilogram bag of regular rice costs just under half that. The Agricultural Ministry, however, says that it has begun mass production of karumi, which will ultimately lower prices. The government is thus hopeful that this innovative rice flour may soon not only become widespread domestically, but become a major export item. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News, Sejong.
Seoul is conducting a public poll to decide on the design of its new city slogan, Seoul My Seoul. The online poll began last Saturday and will run until the end of this month. Those interested can visit the Seoul City website to make their choice for design from 4 final candidates. The chosen design will undergo additional fine-tuning before being officially unveiled in the second quarter of this year. The slogan, Seoul My Seoul, was selected via a similar vote in March.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the United States, Montana has become the first state to ban the popular short video sharing platform TikTok. Governor Greg Gianforte signed the bill on Wednesday. He said to protect the personal data of Montana residents from the Chinese Communist Party. It's been alleged that TikTok's parent company has close ties to Beijing and that the app collects users' private data for use by the Chinese government. The new law will begin in January next year. It will ban app stores from offering TikTok within the state with a potential fine for violators of up to $10,000 per day. TikTok could also be hit with similar fines if it continues to operate within the state. But it's unclear how this will be enforced. Individual users, however, will not be fined. TikTok has responded, calling the ban unlawful. It's promised to defend the rights of its users to continue using the app in the state. Turning over to Colombia now, rescue teams are desperately searching for 4 children believed to have survived a plane crash. Search teams on Wednesday reportedly found a makeshift shelter and items belonging to the children in the thick Colombian jungle. The find generated initial confusion as Colombian President Gustavo Petro on the same day tweeted that the children had been found alive. He deleted his tweet a short time later as reports of their discovery were unconfirmed. The ages of the children range between 13 years and just 11 months. They were aboard a small plane on May 1st along with their mother, a pilot and a co-pilot when the crash occurred. None of the adults survived. In sports news, tennis legend Rafael Nadal has withdrawn from the French Open. The 22-time Grand Slam champion made the announcement Thursday, citing a hip injury. The injury came during a second-round Australian Open defeat in January, which Nadal said is taking longer than expected to heal. The 36-year-old added he will be away from the sport for the next few months and that 2024 is likely to be his final year playing professional tennis. He said that he plans to return in September for the Davis Cup finals. Known as the King of Clay, Nadal has previously won the clay court French Open 14 times. And finally, remarkable video from Turkey circulating on social media shows a sofa seemingly gliding through the air during a storm. Strong winds sent the furniture hurtling into the sky from the balcony of a high-rise building on Wednesday as heavy rains and storms hit the Turkish capital of Ankara. Local reports say the sofa landed in the garden of the person filming the video and remained in one piece. The storms also blew off roofs and windows and uprooted trees. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. Those of us in the western parts of the country are having summer heat again. Not to mention, as for the capital region, we didn't get much relief from the heat yesterday, so it is as hot. While those on the East Coast are having much lower daytime highs due to easterly winds. And further west, stronger sunshine is beaming down with higher UV rays. The sun's rays are strongest between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., so limit exposure to the sun during these hours if you can, and sun protection is a must. Meanwhile, ozone levels will be high in Incheon during the day. Those in Gyeongju are noticing some huge fluctuations in temperatures this week. The area saw daytime highs nearing 35 degrees on Tuesday, but is only getting up to the low 20s this afternoon. And normal to good air quality is expected nationwide all day today. Mostly sunny and warm weekend is in the forecast, but temperatures will go down a few notches from today. Now that's Korea for you. Here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That ends our Friday afternoon newscast. We have our panel session coming up in a few minutes, so do stay with us. Thank you for now.
My name is Andrew Chernesky. I'm the ambassador of the Republic of Belarus in the Republic of Korea. Arirang is a Korean national song which goes deep into centuries, helping for the future generation to understand better the rich history and culture of the Republic of Korea. Today, we have met an opportunity to understand better the Belarusian culture. And we found that there are some things which is common between Belarus and Korea culture, even in spite of remoteness of the countries. And I think in our very complicated world, it's very important to find provisions for making bridges between countries. And I think that studying culture and history of countries helps us to better understand each other, resonating with the word Arirang.
박수 한 번 더 쳐주실 수 있어요? 감사합니다. 처음 널 보고 걱정이 되었어. 우리 아이 이름 어떻게 지어야 예쁠까? 어디까지 양보하고 내서 생각할지 넌 그냥 내가 쓸모없어진 거잖아. 이제 너에게 다가갈게. 다만 널 사랑하고 있어.
Lotte takes a new leap beyond its boundaries. Our change will lead to better lives for all. New Lotte, the power of a better world. New today, better tomorrow. Lotte.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
Lotus Lantern Festival. Let the festival begin. We desire to share Korea's proud culture with the world. So that people can have a time of healing just by watching and become happy as they enjoy the festival. So that joy can stay in their hearts the moment they encounter our festival. That is the reason we want to share our culture with the world. Welcome to Lotus Lantern Festival, Seoul, Korea.
Japan welcomed global leaders at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park on this Friday, which marks the first day of the G7 gathering that addresses, among other issues, Russia's invasion of Ukraine this afternoon. So what role does South Korea hope to play at this latest G7 summit? What are the implications of this year's G7 agenda on current geopolitical tensions? And how have trilateral talks affected tensions on the Korean Peninsula? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Global leaders are gathered in Hiroshima, Japan to address a host of geopolitical challenges, economic concerns and, of course, climate change. For more on this, I have Professor Chung Guyan at Gangwon National University live on the line. Professor Chung, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I also have Dr. Stephen Nerpa, the head of Asia Dialogue over in Hawaii, live on the line as well. Dr. Nerpa, welcome back.
Thank you. Delighted to be back.
Right, Dr. Nerpa, there have been a bit of reports, a number of reports that is, about the prospects of a G8 framework, including South Korea as an official member. Let's start off with your thoughts regarding this particular speculation.
Well, it's interesting, especially as Korea grows its economy from the 10th to the 9th largest in the world. There are 7 additional countries at this G7, the formal G7, Korea and 6 others. But it says a lot about where Korea has gone. And it says a lot about Korea's global pivotal role and how it's emerging as not only an economic, but as a politically relevant player in the region, but also globally. So it is a real step up in Korean diplomacy and something that's quite notable. It also happens in the context of real improvement of late politically in the relations between Japan and Korea, better coordination among the United States, Korea, and Japan, and clearly a lot of common concerns about China, about Ukraine. And so the international impetus makes it important that Korea be there, and it shows Korea in a very positive light.
Right, and talking about Korea's role, Dr. Nerpa, addressing a joint session of the U.S. Congress during his state visit to the U.S., President Yoon pledged that Korea would play a global part, one that matches its economic capacity. What are the prospects of this particular pledge?
Oh, quite important, because Korea, especially in the reconnection in the region with Japan, is diversifying the supply chain. And there's been a lot of international concern relative to China in that regard. So it creates a better atmosphere for Korean business to grow, especially in sectors like technology. It helps Korea-United States relations. Since 2021, Korea has been the largest foreign investor in the United States, the largest provider of FDI. And so that's quite significant, too. And it shows a real impact in terms of not only investment by dollars, but in terms of investment in U.S. jobs. So that's very important for its most critical ally, the United States, and it's good for Korea. So it really presents an opportunity where Korea is rising, showing not only economic might, but political and cultural import that go hand in hand with it, and again makes it such a pivotal player in the regional and international arena, and speaks very kindly to prospects for Korean leadership going forward regionally and globally.
Right, and keeping in mind what Dr. Nerpa has just said, Professor Chung, what role do you suppose does South Korea look to play at this particular G7 summit over in neighboring Japan?
Well, South Korea is not an official member of G7, as Nopo mentions, but is able to join this time. President Yoon will probably hold the bilateral meetings and a number of trilateral and multilateral meetings as well. So given that G7 summit is between like-minded countries who share their views and interests in sustaining rules-based orders, it allows South Korea to understand how these leading countries will resolve the current pending issues, such as Ukraine and Taiwan Strait, as well as advanced technology issue and supply chain issue. It is a great opportunity for South Korea to show its presence in addressing this issue and voice their opinions over them. By doing so, as Nopo mentions, South Korea's kind of foreign policy visions of global people states can be actually realized. It can find more opportunities to serve its regional and global role and contribute to the regional stability and prosperity, not only because it has the capacity, but also it has a willingness to serve that role. Especially South Korea wants to garner support for its North Korea policy as well as like deterrence and sanctions, as well as dissuasions among the participants, and find a way to more coordinate in a seamless way.
Right. Dr. Nerpa, economic security and, of course, the broader global security, as Professor Chung mentioned, are poised for top talks at the G7 summit this time around. What do you suppose are the implications of this agenda amid the current geopolitical tensions?
It's a great question, Sunhee, because this is the most important G7 relative to geopolitical tensions. Originally, the G7 was really catalyzed around economic issues, but as issues of political security and economic security have blossomed and are very much interrelated, it clearly has taken on import. It's taken on import in terms of very specific challenges, things like supply chain diversification, technological cooperation in areas where Korea has great advantage, like semiconductors, and where Japan, too, shares with Korea interests and both supply one another. In terms of other types of economic opportunities, alternative energy, electric vehicles, etc. And it's very important in terms of the geopolitical aspect, concern about Ukraine, concern about Taiwan, as Professor Chung has just mentioned, and trying to find common balance among these democratic nations that are concerned about countries like China, Russia, and the DPRK, and the challenges that they present to a free, liberal, democratic world and to liberal economic models.
Right, and that being said, Professor Chung, do you expect a fresh unified message by the G7 with regard to China's assertive foreign policy and, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I don't think it's going to be fresh, but there will be a unified message. I just checked out the news that President Zelensky will join the G7 summit in person. He just arrived in Japan. So I think this will strengthen the spirit among those 7 countries to criticize revisionist actions of Russia and Ukraine. And Taiwan's trade issue, I think this will be discussed as well. Just before the G7 meeting, Britain and Japan came up with Hiroshima Consensus, which agrees to send aircraft carriers to East China Sea and South China Sea from UK side, which is the second time since 2021, to send a clear signal that China to stay in the rule-based order. So I expect this types of message among 7 countries will circulate across the summit.
And keeping in mind what Professor Chung has just said, Dr. Nerpa, what kind of response do you envision from China and Russia, of course, in the case of a united G7 stance on matters that the 2 countries, of course, consider to be of national interest, such as the situation surrounding the Taiwan Strait and, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine?
Well, clearly, we're in a situation where we have these evolving blocks with countries like South Korea, Japan, and the United States, alongside Australia, New Zealand, India, and others in one faction. And we have China, Russia, the DPRK in another. The concern is that countries like China and Russia are pursuing not only a liberal democracy, but checks on fairness economically and otherwise. And clearly, the war in Ukraine is the most fundamental war and peace issue of the 21st century. And how that is finished, how that is stemmed, will certainly affect the way that China is thinking about issues like Taiwan. It's important to remember that at the same time that the G7 meeting is going on, Xi Jinping of China has just had Central Asian nation leaders together for a summit, which shows you both their interest in access through the old Silk Road, as well as actually offsetting Russia, because that is traditionally Russia's sphere of influence. So there's a lot going on in terms of the international arena and the changing dynamics, and clearly that makes this G7 particularly important, and Korea's presence at it very important as well.
Meanwhile, Professor Chung, trilateral talks among South Korea, Japan and the US took place in November in Cambodia, and the next such interaction hopefully will take place this coming Sunday. That being said, how do you evaluate the security situation here on the Korean Peninsula over the past 6 months?
Well, as Dr. Noper just mentions, U.S. and China competitions are getting stronger. And also Korean Peninsula is not an exception. So North Korea is not talking to anyone in the region, not only South Korea, but also United States, while its tactical alignment with China and Russia becomes more salient. Also, North Korea announced yesterday that it had completed preparation for loading the first military reconnaissance satellite, which is projectile, I guess. So I don't think the security situation in the Korean Peninsula is not getting better. And China further criticized Washington declarations between U.S. and South Korea last month. So overall, this hostile environment gave more reason for South Korea, U.S., and Japan to cooperate more than in the past.
And I extend the same question to you, Dr. Noper. What are your thoughts regarding the status of security here on the peninsula over the past 6 months?
They've become much more concerning, whereas for 70 years we've had a situation of relative stability. The heated words on both sides of the DMZ have raised concern. The fact that the DPRK has tested so frequently and has shown real improvements in terms of their military technology means that the opportunity for mishap, miscalculation, misunderstanding only increases. And that's what I'm most concerned about, not a direct state challenge, but really the type of mishap that could occur amidst this testing or amidst a nuclear test. And so we need to be concerned about that. So while it's very good that the United States, Korea, and Japan have enhanced trilateral coordination and cooperation, we need to think much more creatively about the challenges like nuclear safety, like creating a more stable environment that complements the situation, and creative ways to bring the DPRK to the negotiating table. And also, are there ways to have China and Russia contribute in more positive ways for the peninsula, despite these concerns about an emerging bloc and more hostile relations between the United States and China? So hopefully we can write that to create a level and more steady voyage as we proceed with regional relations. But it does take a very careful look at the very real risks that have increased the last 6 months. And that behooves us all to, again, think creatively and try to find new solutions and join new dialogue.
Right. Professor Jung, some say the upcoming trilateral talks will seek to set up an early warning system to North Korea's nuclear and missile threats through strategic sharing of intelligence. What is the significance, you suppose, of such a setup?
I think this issue has been raised last year during the Phnom Penh declaration and also discussed last April during the trilateral defense meetings. And 3 countries actually discussed on how to make the most of the existing system, which is trilateral information sharing agreement to share missile warning information by North Korea in real time. And I think this issue will be concluded during the Shangri-La dialogue in coming June. So the thing is that in order to respond to the North Korea's missile provocation, the main issue is how quickly it can actually detect and track them in the first place. But individual approach, by Japan, South Korea, and United States has only its limitation. So real-time sharing of missile warnings information among 3 countries to share command and control system, such as radars operated by the Joint Chief of Staffs, USFK, Japan Self-Defense Forces, and so forth and so on. So through the medium of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So this setup means that 3 countries' effort to respond to North Korea's threat is more integrated than in the past and take a more consistent response toward the North and beyond, especially toward China as well.
Dr. Noper, others say such active initiatives among the 3 countries, namely, of course, South Korea, the U.S. and Japan, will lead to greater tangible support for North Korea from Russia and China. What do you say?
Well, it's likely in the context of these increasing blocs. And while it's good, as Professor Chung has just said, that we've had enhanced capabilities and cooperation on the trilateral level, things that make a real difference in terms of our tracking, our monitoring, and of course, the greater issue of extended deterrence, that will lead China, Russia, and the DPRK to think about their own relations and their own preparations. So you will see continued joint exercises between Russia and China. A lot of it will be oriented at trying to find ways to counterweight the United States and its influence in the region. And of course, they will both look at the DPRK for opportunities, certainly not enforcing sanctions and taking a softer view in the United Nations. Were North Korea to test nuclear right now, it would be very hard to get resolutions through the Security Council because of two of the P5 members, China and Russia, objecting to that. So it really will take us all kind of working to strike a better consensus to counter those realities. It's a fairly dark picture. But if we can think creatively and try to find ways to engage all of the players in regional fora through the imprimatur of the United Nations, that's really necessary to strike at a more stable balance in Northeast Asia and for the Korean Peninsula.
Right. Professor Jung, and do feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears like the South Korean administration, the Yoon administration that would be, has been adopting clarity in its foreign policy strategy. Do you see this stance as ultimately serving in favor of South Korea as a whole?
Well, the current Yoon administration took the stance of strategic clarity for many reasons, actually. First, it identifies itself as a liberal democracy, which developed under the current rules-based order. And second, related to this point is that China, Russia, and North Korea is perceived as revisionist countries who do not comply with the current order with different incompatible political system and ideology. Furthermore, against this backdrop, South Korea taking an accommodative stance toward China during the previous Moon administrations, which makes South Korea regarded as a weak link among the like-minded countries coalition, especially between U.S. and Japan, which not only weakened the leverage of South Korea vis-a-vis the North and China, and weakened the coalition of the like-minded countries. So this understanding has made South Korea to took a strategic clarity positions under the current Yoon administrations, and it has been assessed that during the previous administration's stance, which take a strategic less clarity, has not made South Korea's security less getting better. So given that revisionist countries' coalitions are getting serious, I think South Korea's position on this strategic clarity serves its interest so far.
And Dr. Nepo, what are your thoughts? Do you believe Korea's shift to strategic clarity is in its best interests?
Well, it's from a foreign policy perspective, a balance. And there's always a back and forth between strategic clarity and a certain level of strategic ambiguity. And that strategic ambiguity, has surrounded things like U.S. policy on Taiwan, for example. But the clarity in and of itself is perfectly fine. It does show a transparency. It does make it very clear what the implications are for things like DPRK enhancements and testing. That said, there needs to be allowances made and a certain strategic cushion employed so that clarity doesn't mean a ratcheting up of the war of words or some type of escalation. And to counter that escalatory nature is very important. So clarity is good, and we want that in terms of clear communications. But again, we need to combine that with some creative thinking and ways to get people to the negotiating table so that we can counter the types of technological enhancements that the DPRK has made in a rather short time, and that we can counter the concerns and effects of a seventh nuclear test, and that we can show both a common demeanor by way of common democracies, as well as security coordination and longer-term concerns relative to China.
Right, and talking about China, of course, this is an impromptu question, but Professor Jung, do you believe that in the case of a violent confrontation between China and Taiwan, would South Korea be drawn into the conflict, do you think? Speaking entirely within your capacity as a scholar, of course.
Well, it depends on what kind of parameters China actually thinking about in terms of invading Taiwan, if it actually happens. We can think of many different types of scenarios when it comes to Taiwan contingency, but South Korea began to think that we cannot just avoid the situation 100%. Given that South Korea is an ally of the United States, and also we are kind of beginning trilateral cooperations, we cannot but involved into this Taiwan contingency if any types of contingency ever happens. But we also think about what kind of consequences can happen to Korean Peninsula because we have North Korea. North Korea might take advantage of these contingency situations to kind of conduct a more opportunistic behavior, like with or without acquiescence of China. So basically, we have to think about what could happen in the Korean Peninsula perimeters if that contingency ever happened.
Right, and hopefully it will not, of course. Dr. Nerpa, in recent times, quite recently though, quite a number of US scholars have talked about the possibility of a confrontation between China and the US as well. Now, others have pointed to that scenario being highly unlikely, quoting, of course, the recent talks between US officials and their Chinese counterparts over in Vienna, closed-door confrontations, closed-door negotiations, of course. What are your thoughts with regard to prospects of an outright confrontation between the US and China?
Well, I hope those prospects are not likely. And there is always the room, again, for mistaken messages. And we really don't know what Xi and the court in Beijing ultimately will decide. However, what we hope is that they realize, especially in looking at Ukraine, that the lesson has been the dramatic deterioration of the Russian economy, the entire European and Asian front having turned against Russia, the effect of sanctions, and really more importantly, the withdrawal of business and the follow-on effects. That's incredibly important because it shows China how costly misadventure would be for them. And it shows them that indeed the cause of peace and cooperation is much more important. To that end, South Korea is quite important because China relies on it and needs it for investment, for managerial expertise, for insight. And there are cooperative aspects, whether it's on EVs, on health, and other issues that we should be looking at in terms of the complex. So not to demonize China, but to find ways to promote responsible Chinese leadership. So we need to be concerned about that with the evolution of these blocs and try to find ways to make these regional mechanisms more dependent and exemplary by way of trade cooperation, technological exchange, environmental considerations, and less military in nature because we don't want that to be blown out of proportion.
Professor Chung, one final question to you, a very brief one. In recent times, there have also been talk about a potential new Quad arrangement between South Korea, Japan, the US and Canada. What are your thoughts regarding this potential arrangement?
Well, I think Canada actually raised the possibility about a new Quad, including Canada and South Korea. I think it is kind of a trend that a number of countries are suggesting number of multilateral cooperation formats. So I think Canada's suggestion can be understood in this way. But the thing is, what's the purpose of having this quadrilateral kind of format coordinations if that actually occurs? Whether it is kind of targeting North Korea or whether it is targeting China, I think we have to think about what's the kind of purpose of that multilateral cooperation for.
Right, of course, I see. All right, Professor Chung, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Dr. Nerpa over in Hawaii, thank you very much for your insights today.
Aloha and thank you.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we end this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Have a great weekend and see you same time next Monday.